Thank you to the chairman of the trust, Salim Thomas, for that wonderful introduction. And good evening to the members of the trust board, the faculty, the old students, the distinguished guests, the current students, all of you. Thank you for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I want to start by saying how happy I am to be here, how privileged I am to be here, because I have a very early memory of coming to this very campus. It must have been in the early 70s, so clearly sometime after 72, but before 76 when the DMK regime was dismissed for emergency. And my father, who was then an MLA, sent me to deliver some government approval papers to KIT. And I think he used to sit in the same office that you sit now, with very dim lights. And so it was very kind of awe-struck experience to go in. I joined Lovedale only after KIT had left, and so I had no experience of his legacy there. But I remember coming here, and I'm not sure I see the gentleman, but when I was here last time, a distinguished gentleman, father-in-law of one of my close friends, narrated an incident. He is an old Oration as well. And he told me, "Do you know how I ended up going to Lovedale?" I said, "No." He said, "One day I went to the club to meet my uncle who was playing cards with your grandfather. And my uncle said, there's a bright boy, we're going to send him for education someplace." And my grandfather said, "Oh yeah, which school?" And so he said some school, I forget what he said. And my grandfather said, "No, if he's that bright, you should send him to Lovedale." And he turned around and Kit was at the same table. And he said, "You should consider admitting this boy." And he said, "Sure." And that's how he went to Lovedale. And he said his whole life changed based on going to Lovedale instead of going to a different school. So for the many years that my grandfather was friends with Kit, then my father was friends with Kit, though I only got to see him, I think, the one time, I consider it a privilege to be here today to deliver this oration in his memory. I think Salim was stretching a bit to find a topic that a financier like me should talk about education. So it was a bit of a stretch to talk about financing education. But in some sense, it's very core to the notion. Is it that we are cash deprived? Is it that we cannot get better educational outcomes because we cannot afford to spend any more money on education? Or are there other variables and other constraints that will, or that are currently the impediment and could be improved, or by their reduction or elimination could we get better outcomes? I think about this in a couple different contexts. So I spent a lot of years in the US. I got 3 degrees in different subjects, different schools, public education, public university, private university. And in those days, relatively smaller proportion of people went to those kinds of colleges and graduate schools. And then somewhere around the 90s, or maybe early 2000s, there was a big boom in using federal financing to go to these kind of remote education, online training, the Phoenix universities of the world. And there was this big surge in enrollment and alleged degree graduation. But it ended up with, I think, now something like a $3 trillion student debt, outstanding, and some risk that what used to be a mortgage debt bubble is now a student debt bubble. And it's become very political, as you know, about waivers and the Supreme Court and all that. So at least in some parts of the world, just because you have money doesn't mean that the education system or the output or the efficiency or the match of the economy and the society's needs for particular skilled or aware or capable individuals is met. But I want to step back, as a politician, I want to step back to the Madras presidency of 1920, because that was the first time the elections were run under diarchy. And as you have probably heard me say at some YouTube video or the other, what separates Tamil Nadu from the rest of India, and particularly from the Hindi belt, is only one thing. It is that we started inclusive policies and education-based social equity in 1921. Because we've had 100 plus years of doing these things right, making sure that women have access, making sure that all communities have access, making sure we incentivize people to go to school, whether it's through meals or other scholarships, other things. That is the single reason that Tamil Nadu is economically and socially what it is today, and by most measures across social development, human development, economic progress, the number one state in the country. Education is the key. And, of course, now we have a lot of research. We have people like Amartya Sen, John Drays, who talk about why education is the catalyst for societal and structural change. And this was the kind of guiding light of the Dravidian movement going back to 1920. And for those who may not have read the history, the seminal legislations were the right to vote and stand for elections for women, and then compulsory elementary education for boys and girls. So from the age of 6 to 11, free compulsory education. That was a huge revolution. And now what we now know, if you look at academic research papers and all that, as Sen and Drez say, the relationship between educational progress and social change is very clear. The spread of education helps to overcome the traditional inequalities of caste, class, and gender, just as the removal of these inequalities contributes to the spread of education. It becomes a virtuous cycle. The more people know, the more the people realize they have the right to know. And basic education is a tool of social affirmation. It is a way to provide mobility for those who have been economically and socially disadvantaged. And it is a way to reduce the large inequalities between those places that have access, like urban areas and rural, if the government does its job right and spends in equal quality of education across all geographies. So, in the Act of 1920, primary education free and compulsory for all children between the ages of 6 and 11. Now, it's easy to legislate, right? As we all know, especially in this day and age, almost any bill we bring, we pass. We have a majority in the legislature. Question is, can you actually execute and deliver the outcomes that the bill is supposed to guarantee? Now, you think about it. If you have a society where large components, large swaths of the population were not going to school, and you all of a sudden one day legislate that they have to go to school, what are the odds of getting compliance? Pretty close to zero. If you have a law where 90% of the people comply and 10% don't, you can enforce, you can actually use the stick. But if you have a law where 10% of the people comply and 90% don't, the state doesn't have the capacity to enforce the law. It's not within the realm of reality. At that point, you have to use at least some of the carrot, because the stick alone will not work. So if you look at the history, there was a lot of stick involved. I've brought some excerpts from some books going back. And basically what they had to do was go village by village local administration by local administration and basically threatened them. They said, if you do not allow all communities to come, if you do not enroll girls, we will cut off your funding. We will cut off your certification. We will cut off your ability to say that your children are fit to go to the next grade. And that worked to some extent. But the real boom came when somebody had the bright idea to actually start giving food in school. So, in the Corporation of Madras, they tried out for the first time providing free lunch as a way of incentivizing children to come to school. And the numbers are stark. I'll just give you some of the data from back then. In 1922-23, the 5 schools where they did this study had total enrollment of 811. By 24-25, it had gone to 1,671. So it had more than doubled in 2 years once you started providing free food. The problem was that this funding came from the state, and the state said we cannot afford to provide food for so many people. And so you have this wonderful data experiment. It must have been painful to the people back then, but for policymakers like us, what this led to was stopping the program. So by 24-25, when the presidency said we can't afford it anymore, they stopped funding for food. In 5 years, the enrollment dropped by 40%. When they couldn't get food anymore, parents couldn't afford to send their children, and they wanted them to come actually help with whatever labor or whatever shop or whatever they ran. And so in 1927, the Corporation Council decided, as expensive as it is, we got to fund it again. And so they started funding it. And sure enough, again, the enrollment went up dramatically, and they found another 1,000 students came to school. So at some point, the carrot worked a lot better than the stick. The second thing about our education has been the focus on female inclusion, and that's now I'm saying going back to 1920-21. Because it's very, very clear now. If you have a greater proportion of girls in school, and that starts at every step, as I said to the 15th Finance Commission, if you have more of them in elementary school, you have much greater likelihood, that they'll want to go to middle school, and they can go, because you can't just walk into middle school if you've not done elementary school. If you cross that crucial divide of when they start the menstrual cycle and you provide them the menstrual hygiene that they can make it to high school, now you have really conquered the kind of chasm. Because once they stay long enough to go to high school, you get delay in the age of marriage. You get delay in the age of childbirth. You get reduction in the extent of malnutrition or defects. You get reduction in infant mortality. You get a reduction in maternal mortality. You get much greater kind of conception of gender equality. You get much greater likelihood of equalizing skill, equalizing income, and equalizing standing based on financial independence. And so this was also one of the things going back to 1920s that the Justice Party had to fight very hard for. And for various reasons, and I read this excerpt again. It says, social customs such as early marriage, habit of stopping the girls after puberty, and the Padda system were the hurdles which made difficult both the attendance of girls at schools and the provision of women teachers. However, a great impetus was given to girls' education during the time when the Justice Party was in power. A popular system of education at primary level was co-education, and there was no great opposition from any section of the people because they were so young. And it was estimated that approximately 3 lakhs of girls started studying in what were once only boys' schools. So this was, again, one of the ways that we really changed our society. And in fact, if the data that we can now look back and see, around the beginning of the 20th century, female literacy in almost every province of British India was 1%. Now I think in Tamil Nadu it's about 75% or something in the 100 and odd years since. And there's very clear research that if you look at those states like Kerala, like Tamil Nadu, surprisingly like Meghalaya, where the patriarchal norms are much less rigid, then you have much greater outcomes. And then, of course, as I've said again to the 15th Finance Commission, if I want to look at a correlation that predicts per capita GDP, about the strongest correlation is with the percentage of girls that graduate high school. Now, there are aberrations like Gujarat, which have economic outcomes that are not matched by female education. But if I look across all states, it's very clear that that's what drives this education. Now, let's come to the current situation. In Tamil Nadu, the single biggest budget item every year is school education. This year, we allocated about 40,000 crores out of our total budget of somewhere around 3 lakh crores. As a percentage of GDP or GSDP, I agree with Salim that it's not nearly enough. But if I look at it as a per child amount, I think we spend about 300 rupees less per child than the Kendriya Vidyalaya allocation. So it is not, in my opinion, a question of financing. But we have some other kind of once in a lifetime events that have happened. COVID disrupted everything, and it disrupted things in ways that maybe we should have predicted, but we didn't. For example, the enrollment of students in private schools dropped dramatically. It dropped by 10 or 11 lakh students. The enrollment of students in government schools rose significantly. Not nearly 10 or 11 lakhs, but maybe 6 lakhs or 7 lakhs. But if you actually go and look at the detail, there's actually some kind of a waterfall effect. That is, the people who pull their children out of private schools are not pulling them out altogether. Many of them are sending them to government schools. And the people who are in government schools cannot even afford to send their children to government schools. They need them to help with the home or do other things, and so they pull them out of the government school. So you have this like cascading down, negative outcome that is moving downwards. But when we came to office, we realized that there wasn't much leeway actually. Unlike many states, in the state of Tamil Nadu, between teacher compensation and teacher training, the state of Tamil Nadu spends over 90% of its allocation. So over 36,000 crores of the 40,000 crores is spent on teacher compensation, benefits, pensions, and training. And there was only about, 4,000, in 40,000 crores, 4,000, it was even less 2 years ago. So the question is, how do you improve both general outcomes, number one. Number two, social equity, that we don't leave the weakest behind. Because when we started looking, let me give you another statistic and then the good news and the bad news. Tamil Nadu has the highest enrollment of students into tertiary education, what they call the GER, the gross enrollment ratio in tertiary education, which is the percentage of children of college going age that actually enroll in a college. That number for the country is somewhere around 25 to 27%. For Kerala, which is number 2, is high 30s, maybe up to 40. And for Tamil Nadu, depending on whose statistic you take, is between 49 and 52%. That's the good news. What that says is that at least, or at almost 1 in 2, or slightly more, of people eligible to go to college simply by age. That means they must have already graduated high school, otherwise they're not eligible to go. But we are just saying of the total population. I'm not filtering for anything. Of all people of that age of going to college, 52% go. And if we assume that some of them drop out of school and don't go to college, what we're really saying is that 80-90% of our children, boys and girls, actually graduate from plus 2. A huge achievement. That's the good news. The bad news is if we go and look at who are these people who are going and who are these people who are not going, it becomes much, much more kind of stratified and not as kind of what can you say, something to be proud of at all. Because the affluent go, the boys go, the upper caste go, but if you look at uh, government school female graduates, and then if you can stratify based on the location, roughly what community they are, then you find hardly 10-12% of government school female high school graduates coming from the lower stratified in the hierarchy, the backwards or the oppressed classes, formerly oppressed classes, actually were enrolling in school. So the second problem we have is that we are not actually bridging this social divide or social justice. The third problem we had is that 2 years of lockdown basically not only did it disrupt education for everybody, it greatly unevenly disrupted education, right? So I have two boys who were going to school at that age. It was not great that they didn't have their friends to play with, and it was not great that they didn't have, physical interaction. But they each have a room. The school they went to had something like 6 or 8 people in the class. Having an online session with like 7 windows in the screen, reasonable. They had high-speed internet. They had, each had their laptop. If they wanted, they could put it onto the TV. They were affected, but not that badly affected. You start going down from there to the middle class, like 2,000 square foot home, then you go down to the poor, and then you get to the poorest places where they have 400, 500 square feet homes, no access to internet or one smartphone in the entire family, and 3 students who have to go to school. Remote learning is not an option, it is not a feasibility. So these are the kinds of things we had to deal with when we came to power, right? So we had the disruption, we had the great inequality of outcome, and we had really barely any wiggle room to do any substantive increase in spending. Even things like the noon meal scheme, which we do better than most, and now which many people have adopted, maybe 65 to 70% of the spending goes on labor. So maybe 35% goes on food plus energy plus all the other bills associated with it. So I would say we did 3 or 4 things really well, and it wasn't that we were geniuses. Of course, our hearts were in the right place. Of course, we had the brains to go and find the right advisors and the right inputs. But if I had to pick 3 or 4 flagship programs where we balanced all of these, we don't have that much more money to spend. We got to spend it more efficiently. We got to incentivize people, and we got to try and reduce this inequity and bring in the people who can least afford to go into the system. And the first thing we did was we introduced a scheme in the first budget that I spoke back in August of 2021, the amended budget. We called it Illam Thedi Kalvi. And what we said was we were going to do remedial education. And we're going to do it in a way that is so cost effective that we almost can't afford, we can't fail, we can't lose. And what we designed with the help of people like Raghuram Rajan, with the help of people like John Drays, Dr. Narayan, was an approach that said in every block, in every village. And now, if you take a rural school, sometimes a rural school serves 5 villages. So no, but we can't have only one. If there's 5 villages served by one school, we have to have 5 centers for this remedial education. So you create first centers in such a way that nobody has to go more than a few hundred yards from their house. You fund it by providing infrastructure, using available resources like the village hall or the Tahsildar office or the community hall, government supplies the electricity, etc. And we got volunteers from the educated and unemployed youth. So he said to teach kids from the 1st to 5th grade, you have to be a high school graduate from that community, so everybody knew everybody. The teenagers knew the children knew the teenagers. And for 6th to 8th, you had to be a college graduate, again from that community. So of course it was a massive logistics exercise. I think we got something like 8 point something lakh applicants, and then we filtered, and then we brought it down to 3, then we brought it down to about 1 lakh 60, which was the number of centers we had across the state. First we ran the pilot in Madurai, and because I asked for it, so I could monitor it personally. And then we ran it in a few more districts, and then we ran it across the state. But what we did was we didn't focus so much on formal education. We said, let's get them to come and enjoy being together. Let's get cultural programs. Let's get help with homework. There is no structured agenda. It is just the notion of education as a collective, interactive experience rather than sitting in your house and tapping on a phone or a computer. We allocated 200 crores for it the first year. We couldn't spend it all because it took us so long to get the model worked out. We allocated 200 something crores for it last year. We spent more like 250. Compared to 40,000 crores, just think about the cost effectiveness of this program. It was probably the single best program I think that we have done, at least return for money. And we thought that in our hearts. And by great luck, we had the data to back it up. Because what we had done in our MOU with the JPAL, the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, and with MIDS, we already had a longitudinal study going about learning outcomes. And so we had been assessing the kind of advancement of children in about 30 or 40,000 data point, 40,000 children over several communities. We had been tracking their progress over time. And because we had this great data set, we were able to restart when schools just opened, and then we were able to check again a year and a half later after this program had been in effect. And the results were stark, right? I mean, 2 years of lockdown basically reduced 2 years of progress. So somebody who was reading at a 5th grade level 2 years later was still reading only at a 5th grade level. That's how stark the lockdown affected people, at least in this data set we had. And in a year and a half, basically, they had recovered about 2/3 of the lockdown loss. Well, this is a very, very young children, and we're not talking about very complex things, basic math, basic reading. And because we only did this pilot in some places and we didn't do it in all, and because not every parent sent their children to the after school program, we were basically able to make a distinction between those who benefited from the after school program and those who did not. And the results were so impressive that roughly 2/3 of the learning recovery happened, because they came to school, but about 1/3 of it happened because of the Illam Thedi Kalvi program. That is the remedial education in their neighborhood with their community kind of mentor. And it wasn't like we were teaching them like rocket science, right? We were teaching them to be back in school and to do basic math and things like that. In fact, it was such a good outcome, and it was such a unique data set that nowhere else in the world had that timing worked out, that they'd been tracking 20 or 30,000 students at that particular time before COVID, that this was presented in the UN General Assembly's Associated Education Program by Professor Karthik Muralidharan, who we work with. I don't know if he's here today, from CGIS. So this was one place where I think we found a way to benefit all way. And it also showed, incidentally, it showed that those children that had the greatest loss also had the greatest benefit, because those children that had the greatest loss were the ones who didn't have access to computer or a smartphone or enough space. They were the poorest of the poor, and they had the greatest benefit from coming back together. The second thing we did was we changed what had been the incentive program for girls to stay in school and get degrees. It had been called a marriage assistance program. So basically it said if you stay in school and graduate from high school, when you get married, the government gives you 25,000 rupees and 4 grams of gold. Now this is across all governments, I'm not talking politics. Our government introduced it at some level, Ms. Jayalalitha took it to some other level, our government took it to some other level. We kept increasing the incentive, but the basic design was, if you graduate high school, when you get married, the government gives you this money as a way of incentivizing you to stay in high school. And then there was a higher level that says if you graduate college, then you get 50,000 rupees and 8 grams of gold as a way of incentivizing you to stay in college. The problem with that again was partly because of bad fiscal management, and again, if there's one very clear indication, those states that manage their fisc well invest more in education and get better educational outcomes. Again, not rocket science, but it's very clearly demonstrable by many studies, not least by the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. So, mostly because the fisc deteriorated rapidly, our predecessor couldn't keep up with this program. Also, they claimed they couldn't get access to gold because the gold value shot up like crazy for various reasons in the pandemic and through lockdown and all, I mean, through demonetization and all that. So, they effectively ran 4 years behind. Now, when we came to office, we were stuck because the whole point, I can even justify this kind of money for marriage both ways. I can justify it as a post hoc incentive to stay in school or in college, and I can justify it as a kind of insurance or risk mitigator against a family falling into debt for the sake of a wedding because the government gives them the cash. Both ways I can live with it. Other people may call it freebies. I personally can live with this program. The problem is, if there's 4 years of backlog, there is no way to fix this program other than to pay for 5 years worth at one time, because there's no value to the money if you give it 3-4 years after the marriage. By then they would have to take the loan. So this whole like loss of going, prevention of going into loan is wiped. And if the people don't think the money is going to come, then it's not clear the incentive value is great either. So the only way to fix this program at that time, the obvious way, was to do 5 years worth of clean out in 1 year. We barely had the money to do 1 year. How are we going to do 5 years? So at that time, after a lot of discussion, a lot of input, we decided to change the program altogether. We said rather than do post hoc incentivization, that is, after they graduate, we give them money, let us incentivize them in real time. And so we renamed the program slightly and we redesigned it completely. And we said, here's what happens. If you study in government schools till 10th class and then you go to a polytechnic or an ITI, every month that you stay in the polytechnic or ITI, the government pays you 1,000 rupees a month. And if you stay till 12th in a high school that is run by the government and then you go to a college, any college, arts, science, engineering, medicine, anything, and this is not going to be affected by your other scholarships, by the 7.5% reservation, by the first time, first generation graduate, all those other programs is incremental, supplemental. We will give you 1,000 rupees a month as long as you stay in college. This now is not post hoc incentivization, it's real-time incentivization to actually stay in college. And I think again, it was one of the better schemes we've done. It didn't cost us that much by, again, relative to 40,000 crores, it was 400 or 600 crores. We didn't get the uptake we wanted because we were not able to get it executed very rapidly. Because we said, since we are announcing it mid-year, all those who are already in college, who would have fit this criteria before they joined, we'll pay them also. But we're only able to get about 2 lakh students who are already in college or in ITIs or in polytechnics who would have met this when they started. But because we advertised and cast the net wide and did a lot of this stuff, this year's enrollment, that is the 22-23 enrollment, went up significantly by 30,000-40,000 students into the first year. And about 10 or 15,000 of them were people who had dropped out. That means they had passed +2 a year or two ago, and because of lack of money had not gone into college. And now because we were going to pay them to go to college, they actually came back and started going to college. So again, I would say, money-wise, this was a very, very effective way of getting our outcome. I'll finish with one kind of money example and then I'll just talk about a few other things. One of the best schemes that I have seen so far is our free breakfast scheme that we ran pilot last year, and now we've expanded to all elementary schools this year. Now, if you're doing free lunch, free breakfast is not, in theory, a great leap. But the problem with breakfast is, I think more and more research shows that as important as free lunch is, breakfast is even more important, because if children don't have calories in them when they begin the day, they cannot focus, they're not able to actually concentrate on their studies. Many times, because the parents can't feed them, the kids don't want to go to school, they're still hungry, they don't want to come to school hungry. So all this research showed us that, and it was incidentally, it was not in our election manifesto. We had not promised that we would give free breakfast. It was in the Union government's NEP, it was in the ADMK's manifesto, but for whatever reason, we had not put it in our manifesto. But a good idea is a good idea, whoever it comes from. So we looked at it and we realized that providing breakfast, particularly for the young children for the elementary school, would be a huge game changer. The problem was we couldn't go the way of the noon meal scheme where we'd end up with again 70% of the cost being labor. It would just become prohibitively expensive. So what we ended up doing is kind of a two-pronged approach. The first, in the rural areas, we said we will give these monies as block grants to the local bodies, and the local bodies will create self-help groups. Self-help groups of the parents, mostly mothers, of the children who are going to benefit from this program. Those self-help groups will be given the money to purchase the provisions and to make the breakfast. This thing turned out to be much cheaper than doing the noon meal scheme. Same way, in the urban areas, we said what we're going to do is the equivalent of community kitchens or cloud kitchens. We're going to put heavy level of automation, wherever possible IoT, let the computer drive the machine, and standardize the procurement, make the corporations responsible for running the central kitchens, making the food, and then running little trucks to deliver it to the schools. Where, in my constituency, for example, urban constituency, there's only probably 12 or 13 primary schools. So it's not that hard to have one or two kitchens that can supply these schools. Again, when we did the pilot, it cost us 30 or 40,000 crores. This year, 30 or 40 crores. This year, we've expanded it to the whole state, and we estimate it'll cost us about 500 crores. Amazing. We thought we were doing something based on nutrition, based on good outcomes. What we did not expect was the huge spike in attendance, right? And in my assembly speech, I alluded to it. And something like 90% of the schools found increased attendance. I'm not talking about increased enrollment. I'm saying of those children that were enrolled there, more of them actually came to school after they started getting breakfast. I thought that was great. Then I went in to look at the ratios, and I found that something like another 40 or 50% of the schools had greater than 20% increase in enrollment, beyond my wildest dreams. In 3 or 4 districts, 100% of the schools had greater attendance because of this program. In fact, I would say that at least in my constituency, many middle class working mothers say, why can't the government extend this program to non-government schools, to aided schools and private schools, because breakfast is a lot different than lunch. It's not just a question of money. It's also a question of time. It's also a question of being able to get the food ready before 7 a.m. or 6:30 a.m. or 7:30 a.m. and to be able to get it into the hands of the children before the mothers go to work and so forth. So again, I would say money is important, but how you design programs and how you execute them is probably much more important. Now, we've done a lot of other things. We have a program called Ennum Elithum Mission, where we funded a few hundred crores a year to ensure minimum outcomes by 5th grade in terms of basic math, language, etc. We have different ways of incentivizing scholarships for the Adi Dravida community, for the ST community, for the BC community. We run government schools and hostels. This year, I've announced in my budget that we're going to bring all of these special schools, SC/ST schools, under the purview of the school education department, because education is such a technical thing that were we to continue to run these under Adi Dravida welfare department, they don't really have the expertise to run the schools. And, we are creating some kind of a 2-tier system of education. So we put it there. We also have further up the curve things like the non-Mudalvan scheme, career counseling to students, their parents, helping them find the right path rather than all go to engineering or all go to arts and science and not find employment afterwards. We have invested hugely in the last 2 years in polytechnics and ITIs, thousands of crores, because Tamil Nadu, we don't have enough skilled trades to support our growth rate, our manufacturing industry. We have announced a 7,000 crore program for infrastructure under the name of Perasiriya Anbalagan, and we are building, more with CSR. In my constituency, for example, HDFC Bank has been a wonderful partner, and almost every school in my constituency, every public school in my constituency, we put in, high-tech classrooms, labs, libraries, better toilets, things that bring people to school and keep them in school. I think there's a lot more to do. I'm in a very delicate position because I'm also the Minister for Human Resources Management. I'm also the Minister for Pensions. And if I say too much about the relative cost of these things, I will unnecessarily create friction, political friction. I don't want to go into that. But I will say that we have a structural problem. We are spending a lot of money. We are not getting necessarily the right outcomes. As I said before, we're not spending that much less than a Kendriya Vidyalaya. And I don't think anybody is going to tell me that we get substantially equivalent outcomes. I know what the demand is as a politician. How many people come and ask me, can you please get my children into Kendriya Vidyalaya? But I think somewhere between enlightened application of funds, the creation of a bit of kind of volatility in the system. We've announced a lot of model schools, a lot of other initiatives. And I think accountability and measurement. The more we track outcomes, the more we feed those back into the design, the more we are able to look at some hope, some light that says that this is not a permanent kind of problem and it gets better all the time. I think the crisis has been, in many ways, an opportunity for us to learn, for us to understand the relative value of things, for us to truly appreciate how great the divide is, how great the access variability is, that we are by no means, as much pride as we take in our progress in social justice and in the fact that our Gini coefficient, this wealth inequality, is probably 10% lower than the national average. That's still a very, very big gap. We have opportunity because we have this huge enrollment increase in government schools. It is our moment to create enough momentum, if you will, that people don't feel the need, once the economic recovery takes full bloom, that they should move back to the private schools. Equitable outcomes in education, and because we're in a global economy, a competitive outcome relative to almost any other large population center in the world is going to be the defining factor of how fast we can grow. It is simply down to that. Everything else is fungible. Everything else moves. Money moves. High-skilled talent moves. Machines can be imported. Trade barriers are dropping for the most part, despite short-term disruptions. Where do we have the talent? Where do we have a relatively harmonious and compatible to global perspective society? Where do we have infrastructure? Where do we have connectivity? Most of all, where do we have the talent? And so I think enlightened administrations and governments, our job is to, yes, find the funds, yes, increase the ratio, but above all else, find ways to incentivize social change and behavior so that we get the kinds of outcomes that match our philosophy. We come to government, we come to politics with an approach, with a philosophy, with a morality. We believe that social justice is the building block of a good society. We believe that access to mobility through education has been the secret of our success for 100 years, and we want to accelerate that. We know we're in a competitive environment globally, within the country, with other states, and we know that no single variable is more important than human capital development, and education is the basis for all that. So, I would say, given the situation, given how early it is in our regime, we've spent less than 2 years in office. I think we have started to move in the right direction. There's a lot more to do, and I hope with time we will continue to innovate, continue to provide better and better outcomes and better examples. Incidentally, I must tell you that the RTE Act in the Union Budget almost exactly mirrors the words of the 1921 Justice Party Compulsory Education Act. That's whatever, 90 years later. I must also say that as a percentage of our budget, we have never cut back on either education as a whole or Anganwadis. And in my constituency, for example, 5 years as an opposition MLA, I think I built 10 or 11 Anganwadis. Day before yesterday, I opened another one. So I'm using the MLA Constituency Development Fund. So I'd like to think what distinguishes people like me is that we act the same, whether we're in opposition or we're in government. Our values stay the same, whether we talk about local or state or national politics. And our actions and our legislation and our allocation of money matches the philosophy and the values that we came into politics with. So I think I will stop there, and I don't know what the format is, whether questions are encouraged or it's just the oration, but I'm happy whichever way you see fit. Yeah? Thank you. Thanks.
Hi. Thank you very much for the speech. That was great. But I realized, as you said, it puts yourself in a bit of a difficult position given your different roles. But I was wondering whether the government had ever considered an American-style charter school model, because you spoke about the inefficiencies in the labor costs and such. So introducing some private competition and allowing parents to take their business around, essentially, do you think that could benefit by spending the same amount of money?
That's a very touchy topic, but I think we've already announced a few things along those lines in terms of schools of excellence, partnership with, particularly in the kind of polytechnic ITI, but also in schools. For example, one of the best schools in my town, though not my constituency, my city, is sponsored by the Shiv Nadar Foundation. And they put a lot of money and they run a lot of additional programs and produce spectacularly good results. So, and a lot of people move to that kind of area to put their children in that school. But we are a very, tradition-bound society. It's quite hard to make step changes that often. But I think the principle of encouraging thinking outside the box, as well as let's try different models, and that puts pressure on those who do it the old way. I think we're buyers of that philosophy. We cannot quite do it that rapidly. But I've seen charter schools in the US when I was there, and I agree. I think the company I worked for sponsored one in Newark in the inner cities and made a big difference.
Thank you very much.
I have a question for the minister. One of the problems with educating people, through high school and college is then guaranteeing employment or encouraging employment. One of the problems today is that many of them are unemployable. They need to have soft skills trained, or even if they have that, there are not enough jobs?
This is a huge problem. So I think that's why the CM's program, which he calls Nan Mudalvan, is our way of transforming the kind of skill match between what the economy and the companies require and what the education system puts out. At first, starting at the existing pool of labor. So we've tied up with the government of Germany, for example. We are in talks with Australia. We talk with a lot of countries that need highly skilled labor, don't have the population count, and are willing to work with us to develop training programs here. And that could be from very specialized like robotic mechanics to much less sophisticated things like I don't know, skilled chefs, let's say. I mean, meaning it's not science and technology, it's more art, to things like nursing and so forth, where we are trying to get them certified to Australian standards or to German standards or to other standards in Tamil Nadu, partly because some of them will migrate, but partly because we can bring that level of skill set into the local industry and prove kind of a breeding ground for similar talent. But that's picking the people who are already out there now and are not able to get jobs. The way to prevent so many people getting out there without the skills to get jobs is to start this much, much earlier through career counseling, through soft skill development, through matching of expectation with reality, getting better data on what the economy needs and passing that down through the school system and to the parents of the children. Part of the problem is that the enrollment has exploded so high. Like I gave away degrees at a girls' college, in a women's college, 10 days ago, something. 60% of the graduates are first-time college graduates. That's the good news. The bad news is who is going to mentor them? Both the parents have not really understood what the college graduate employment economy looks like. The state has a big role to play in bridging that gap so that people make enlightened choices about what to study and studying what will lead you to what career path and to what outcome after that. And so I think you tackle the existing problem through better skilling, add on like soft skills, all this stuff, but you prevent it from becoming a problem by giving people the information to make more enlightened choices 10, 15 years ahead of coming into the labor market so that you don't have this gap again.